somewhat in our next story, A Mother, where some of the comic tendencies of Dublin's speech interact with the haughty Mrs. Carney, whose daughter is about to embark on a musical career. This reading will be followed by the song Believe Me If All Those Endearing Young Charms, symbolising a mother's hopes and dreams of her talented and charming young daughter. And now we will have our reading of an extract of A Mother.
A Mother. Miss Devlin had become Mrs. Carney out of spite. She had been educated at a high-class convent where she had learned French and music. When she came to the age of marriage, she was sent out to many houses where her playing and her ivory manners were much admired. But the young men whom she encountered there were ordinary, and she gave them no encouragement, trying to conceal her romantic desires by eating a great deal of Turkish delight in secret. Besides, however, when her friends began to loosen their tongues about her, she silenced them by marrying Mr. Carney, who was a bootmaker on Ormond Quay. He was much older than she. After the first year of married life, Mrs. Carney perceived that such a man would wear better than a romantic person. He was a model father. He ensured for both his daughters a dowry of £100 each when they reached the age of 24. He sent the elder daughter, Kathleen, to a good convent where she learned French and music. And afterwards, he paid her fees at the academy. Every year in the month of July, Mrs. Carney found occasion to say to some of her friends, "My good man is packing us off to Skerries for a few weeks." If it wasn't Skerries, it was Holt or Greystones. On special Sundays, when Mr. Carney went with his family to the Pro-Cathedral, a little crowd of friends would gather after Mass at the corner of Cathedral Street. They were all friends of the Carneys, musical friends. And when they had played every little counter of gossip, they shook hands with one another and said goodbye in Irish. Soon, the name of Miss Kathleen Carney was heard often on people's lips. They said she was very clever at music. Therefore, Mrs. Carney was not surprised when one day Mr. Holland came to see her and proposed that her daughter should be the accompanist at a series of grand concerts at the Ancien Concert Rooms. Mr. Holland, the assistant secretary of the Air Abu Society, had been walking up and down Dublin for nearly a month arranging this series of grand concerts. A contract was drawn up by which Kathleen was to receive 8 guineas for her services as accompanist at the 4 grand concerts. Mrs. Carney bought some lovely blush pink charmeuse at Brown Thomas's to let into the front of Kathleen's dress. She took a dozen 2-shilling tickets and sent them for the grand concert and sent them to those friends who couldn't be trusted otherwise to come. The concerts were on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. When Mrs. Carney arrived with her daughter at the Ancien Concert Rooms on Wednesday night, she didn't like the look of things. She wondered, had she mistaken the hour? No, it was 20 minutes to 8. In the dressing room, she was introduced to the secretary of the society, a Mr. Fitzpatrick. He was a little man with a white vacant face, and she noticed that he had a flat accent. When it was time nearly past 8, the few people in the hall had begun to express their desire to be entertained. Mr. Fitzpatrick came in and said, "Well now, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose we better start the ball." Mrs. Carney regarded this flat final syllable with a stare of consent and said to her daughter encouragingly, "Are you ready, dear?" When she had the opportunity, she called Mr. Holohan aside. He said that the committee had made a mistake in arranging 4 concerts, and they had decided to let the first 3 concerts go as they pleased and reserve all the talent for the final Saturday night. As the mediocre items followed one another, the people in the hall grew fewer and fewer, and the concert finally expired shortly before 10. The concert on Thursday night was better attended, but Mrs. Carney saw that the audience behaved indecorously, as if the concert was some sort of dress rehearsal. Mr. Fitzpatrick seemed to be enjoying himself, from time to time jutting out his head and exchanging a laugh with a couple of his friends on the balcony. Mrs. Carney learned that the Friday night concert had to be abandoned, and the committee was going to move heaven and earth to secure a bumper house on Saturday night. She buttonholed Mr. Holohan and asked him, was it true? Yes, it was true. Mr. Holohan, but of course that doesn't alter the contract, she said. The contract was for 4 concerts. Mr. Holohan advised her to speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick said he will bring the matter up before the commission. And why is that? Mrs. Carney thought well to tell her husband about these suspicions. She respected her husband in much the same way as she respected the General Post Office as something large and secure and fixed. And though she knew the small number of his talents, she appreciated his abstract value as a male. She was glad when he suggested that he should accompany her. The night of the grand concert came. Mrs. Carney and her husband and daughter arrived at the Onction concert room 3/4 of an hour before the time at which the concert was to begin. Mrs. Carney went looking for Mr. Holohan or Mr. Fitzpatrick. She could find either, and had to go back to the dressing room as the artistes were arriving. The seats were beginning to fill up rapidly, and a pleasant noise percolated in the auditorium. Mrs. Carney found Mr. Holohan and asked him when her daughter was going to be paid. Mr. Holohan said Mr. Fitzpatrick had charge of that. Mrs. Carney said that her daughter had signed a contract for 8 guineas and she would have to be paid. Mr. Holohan said that wasn't his business. Why isn't it your business? Didn't you bring her the concert? Anyway, it is not your business, it's my business, and I mean to see to it. You better speak to Mr. Fitzpatrick. I don't know anything about Mr. Fitzpatrick, or Mrs. Carney, and I intend to see this carried out. When she came back to the dressing room, Mr. O'Madden Burke and the man from the Freeman's Journal were there. The Freeman man said that O'Madden Burke would write the report and he would see that it in. Mrs. Carney began speaking so animatedly to her husband that he had to ask her to lower her voice. The bass, Mr. Duggan, was the son of a hall porter, but he had risen from this humble state and made himself a first-class artist. He said "use" so soft it was hardly noticed, and he drank nothing stronger than milk for the sake of his voice. Mr. Bell, the first item, stood ready with his music, but the accompanist made no sign. Mr. Carney looked straight ahead of him, stroking his beard. Mrs. Carney spoke into Kathleen's ear with subdued emphasis. From the hall came the sounds of encouragement, clapping, and stamping of feet. Mr. Holohan went over to Mrs. Carney and spoke with her earnestly. While they were speaking, the noise in the hall grew louder. Mr. Holohan became very red and excited. He spoke volubly, but Mrs. Carney said curtly at intervals, "She won't go on. She must get her 8 guineas. She won't go on without her money." Mr. Holden hobbled out in haste. The noise in the auditorium had risen to a clamour when Mr. Fitzpatrick burst into the room, followed by Mr. Holden, who was panting. Mr. Fitzpatrick counted out £4 notes into Mrs. Carney's hand and said that she would get the other half at the interval, but she said, "But this is 4 shillings short." But Kathleen gathered in her skirt and said, "Now, Mr. Bear," who was shaking like an aspen. The singer and the accompanist went out together. The noise in the hall died away. There was a pause for a few seconds, and then the piano was heard. The first tenor and the contralto, however, brought down the house. Kathleen played also a selection of Irish airs, which was generously applauded. All this time, the dressing room was a hive of excitement. Mr. O'Madden Burke said it was the most scandalous exhibition he'd ever seen. Miss Kathleen Carney's musical career was ended in Dublin after this. Pay her nothing. Mrs. Carney said that the committee had treated her scandalously, that they thought they had a girl to deal with, but she would show them their mistake. If they didn't pay her to the last farthing, she would make Dublin ring. As soon as the first part of the programme was ended, Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mrs. Holden went over to Mrs. Carney and told her that the 4 guineas would be paid after the committee meeting the following Tuesday. If her daughter did not pay for the second part of the programme, the committee would consider the contract broken and pay her nothing. Mrs. Carney said angrily, "My daughter has a contract. She will get £4.8 into her hand, or a foot she won't put on that platform." "I'm surprised at you, Mrs. Carney," said Mr. Holden. "I never thought you would treat us this way." Her face was inundated with angry colour, and she looked as if she would attack someone with her hands. "I am asking for my rights," she said. "You might have some sense of decency," said Mr. Holden. "When I ask when is my daughter going to be paid, I am told, 'Oh, you must speak to the secretary.' 'Oh, it's not my business.' 'Oh, I'm a grand fellow, Father didn't know.'" After that, Mrs. Carney's conduct condemned on all hands. Everyone approved what the committee had done. She stood at the door, haggard with rage, arguing with her husband and daughter and gesticulating with them. She stood still for an instant like an angry stone image, and then said to her husband, "Get a cab." As she passed through the doorway, she stopped and glared into Mr. Holden's face. "I am not done with you yet," she said. "But I'm done with you," said Mr. Holden. And he began to pace up and down in order to cool himself. He felt his skin was on fire. "Oh, that's a nice lady," he said. "Oh, she's a nice lady." "You did the proper thing, Holden," said Mr. O'Madden Burke, poised upon his umbrella in approval.